presentation is on how do we create environmental awareness through Anglican liturgy. And for today, I'd like to cover the following topics. Why is liturgy important for us as Anglicans? What do we mean when we use the term liturgy? What are the elements that make up liturgy? I want to do some examples of liturgy in the Bible and also examples of liturgies that we've been involved in. I want to talk about some of the rules of liturgy and then just share with you some ideas or experiences of how to develop a liturgy. So, most of us, when we think about where the Anglican Church started, have heard the story of Henry VIII. I used to run or we used to do, when I was in Bonteheuwel, we used to run something called a Christian school. And I would do a course on the prayer book. And part of that course was in Anglican history. And I would always start by asking, why did the Anglican Church split from Rome? And the first thing everyone would say is because of a divorce. Most of us kind of know the story about Henry VIII wanting a divorce, but of course it was actually an annulment. So we have that story of Henry VIII wanting an annulment, but there was another story that we don't often talk about. It's the story of the Reformation on continental Europe, how the churches in the continent were breaking away from Rome and seeking independence from the Pope. And so at the same time as Henry VIII wants an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, there's also the Reformation happening and churches in Europe breaking away. And that's important because the Anglican Church becomes part of that Reformation history and the breaking away from Rome. And one of the things that makes the Anglican Reformation significant is that Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, realized that, yes, it's important that we put the Bible in the hands of the people, which was a central tenet of the Reformation, that we put the Bible in the hands of the people so that the people are able to own their faith. But Cranmer said, the Bible is one thing, unless people know what to do with the Bible and they know what to do with the stories in the Bible, they cannot fully own their faith. And so part of what makes Anglicanism unique within that Reformation history is the development of the Book of Common Prayer as a way of putting the liturgy into the hands of the people and allowing people in that way to tell their own stories, to understand who God is, to make sense of who God is through the prayers, through the liturgy, through the structure of the service. What's also significant is that with the Book of Common Prayer, Thomas Cranmer puts the same book into the hands of the priest and into the hands of the people, so that what the priest has, even today, what we have in front of us when we lead the service is exactly the same book as the people have. And so liturgy for us as Anglicans is a way of allowing the people of God to own their own faith, to discover who God is, and to discover who we are in God. What is liturgy? The term liturgy is derived from a Greek term which means public work or the work done on behalf of the people. Liturgy can either be led by an individual, it can either be the work of an individual on behalf of the people, or it can be work of a group on behalf of the people. But what's important is that there must be participation from the people. It's it's an act led on behalf of the people, but also that calls for participation of the people. Liturgy forms the basis of our relationship with God and with each other. In liturgical theology, there's a beautiful statement that most people will only ever meet God in the liturgy. And so through the prayers, through the hymns that we sing, through the sermons that are done, through the reflections, it's in those moments where the liturgy helps us to think about who God is, but also to experience who God is. That for many people will be the primary way in all of their lives that they will experience God through the elements of the liturgy. Another way that we use the term liturgy is that liturgy is the structure of the service that we put together. So when we speak about liturgy, we are speaking about the act of liturgy, and the act of worshiping God, but we are also speaking about, in another way, the form of how we worship God and how that liturgy is put together. So why do we have liturgy? Core to Anglican liturgy is the phrase ora et labora. It literally means I've put down the term work and pray. So core to Anglican liturgy is that we pray and we work. That our day isn't only made up of working and working and working, but that there's this constant toing and froing of work and prayer. I meant to put up two phrases. The second phrase that I wanted to put up, the first one, ora et labora, is work and prayer, that there needs to be a balance in our day. The second one is lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief, or what we pray is what we believe. Or put differently, when I hear what you pray, when I hear what you sing, when I hear how you preach, then I understand what you believe about who God is, about who you are in God, about what God means to you. And so liturgy becomes a way of us speaking about who God is and about what our understanding of God is, but also our understanding of who we are. I want to pause and just say, last week I put up a few questions to say, when we talk about climate change, why is it a theological challenge? Because when we talk about human-induced climate change, and we talk about people having the ability to change the nature and the function of the earth, what does that say about our relationship to God? What does that say about how we stand in relation to God as creator and us as creation? And again, when we develop our liturgies, we have to ask questions around what does the liturgy tell us about who God is? That God remains creator. That what does the liturgy tell us about who we are? Well, God has made us stewards of what God has created. How have we cared for what God has created? So we don't become creator. We have always been called to be stewards of what God has created. And our response to God is in how we care for what God has created. And when we haven't, then our liturgy helps us to go back to God and say, forgive us for what we've done or not done, and help us to move forward in a new and different way. Liturgy gives us a common way in which to speak and a common way in which to relate to God, so that it's not just about me and what I want, but it becomes a collective action and how all of us together are able to respond to God. Liturgy also provides us with a structure, and in many ways, the structure also gives us a sense of security so that we know that we're not going to arrive at church and anything can happen, but there's a structured way in which we do things. There's an orderly way in which we are going to worship. The theologian Hans Kung says that liturgy is and remains the center of the life of the church. And when he speaks about liturgical reform, he says, if liturgy can be successfully renewed, won't that also have effects on all the areas of church activity? And so if we want to change any aspect of the church, we have to begin with changing the liturgy, because what we believe is what we pray, and what we pray tells us what we believe. In the 1970s, the US Catholic bishops said in one of their statements, faith grows when it is well expressed in celebration. Good celebrations foster and nourish faith. Poor celebrations weaken and destroy faith. To celebrate the liturgy means to do the action or perform the sign in such a way that the full meaning and impact shines forth in clear and compelling fashion. So what are the elements of liturgy? So if we're speaking now about liturgy as the form of what we do, there are various elements that make up a liturgical act or a divine service. There are prayers, we have songs, and those songs can either be hymns, they can be choruses, they can be in the vernacular, it can be hymns or songs that have been written even as part of the process, as we often have on youth camps. There's poetry that can be done as part of the liturgy. We have reflections, there's sermons, we can have discussions as part of a liturgy. An important thing that we often don't make good use of is silence as an element of liturgy, not as the absence of something in liturgy, but silence as an intentional act in liturgy and as a way of helping us reflect and a way of helping us feel. And then, of course, for us as Anglicans, our vestments, altar frontals, candles, incense, all of those things together make up the elements of liturgy. So, just a few examples. There are many, many examples of liturgy in the Bible, but I'm highlighting here just a few. The first one is if we look at the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 18, there's set rules for what the priests are to do, and quite detailed rules about when you do the sacrifice, first this and then that and then that. When you lead the people, it's first this and then that and then that. Quite detailed rules about how things follow one after the other after the other. And what will happen if those rules are not followed. 2 Samuel chapter 6 starts with David dancing before the Lord, but wearing priestly garments as he does so. And so David is worshiping God, but also stands in his role as the priest king. We have in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have the exiles returning from Babylon. And one of the first acts is that Ezra stands before the Israelite community and reads them the law. And many of them would never have heard the law before. There's a beautiful picture of the people crying as that many of them had been told about the law, but have never heard the law being read before. They cry as they realize that these are promises that God has made. These are promises that God has given to them, and they become the recipients of those promises. So that very beautiful way in which in Ezra and Nehemiah, liturgy becomes the way in which Ezra and Nehemiah form that community once again, a community that had been fragmented by the Babylonians and by the exile, how the building of the wall becomes a physical sign of the rebuilding of the community, but liturgy becomes a way in which they draw the community and draw that nation back together. Another example of liturgy is in the Last Supper. So we have quite detailed ways, and we of course recount that story every week when we do the Eucharist, how Jesus took and blessed and broke and gave, how that was within a particular Jewish context that had its set rules, had its set prayers, had its requirements of what could happen and were not supposed to happen. And so a very particular kind of liturgy that happens over there. And then we have also in the book of Acts several examples of liturgy and the early church, how the early church gathered together to have meals together, to worship together, to discuss, and of course also to induct new members into the body. I want to give some examples now of some liturgies that I've been involved in. 2 years ago, when in Cape Town we had a water crisis, we decided to have a focus on water during Lent. And so we had 5 weeks of Bible studies and reflections on water. For the church in Bonteheuwel, where I served at the time, one of our services we did as an outdoor service. So we took the congregation to one of the storage dams, about probably 100 kilometers outside of Cape Town. And we walked around the dam, and at various points in the dam, or at various points around the dam, we explained what was happening, what people could see around the dam, what it meant. And then we had a prayer and we had a song or a Bible reading as we went along. So it became a prayer walk as we walked around the dam, where the people were being educated about water conservation, but it was also an act of prayer and an act of worship as we gave thanks to God for water, as we asked for forgiveness for how we had used the water, and as we recommitted ourselves to using water in a responsible way. Another one that we've done is at baptism. So at baptism, we have water as the central symbol. And one of the baptisms, we asked the parents to bring a bottle of water from home. And we specifically asked them to bring tap water. And then on the day, we took everyone's water and poured that into the font. And then preaching from the font, we then said that the water that's now in the font is the same water that you get from your tap. It's the water that you use to drink. It's the water you use to cook. It's the water you use to wash. It's the water you use for gardening. It's exactly the same water that you would use throughout your day that you have now brought for baptism. But we all know that when it comes to the water of baptism, irrespective of how much water is used for the baptism, none of us would ever speak disparagingly about the water of our baptism. And so we said, but in the same way, we should also think of all water as sacred, as all water as being blessed, as all water as being from God, and water that needs to be used in a responsible way, because all water creates life, and all water is sacred. So again, working the story of water conservation into a common story and into the liturgy of baptism. And then last year, with all the conversations on land, we did a series of Bible studies on land, and beginning with where people are, so what is the place you call home? What is the place you have always called home? What is the place you have previously called home? Why were you moved from one place to another? Um, how do you relate to a place where you've previously lived? And then using stories from the Bible, we then show how Israel was promised the land through Moses, or sorry, through Abraham. God promises to give the land to the people of God. How at various stages the Israelites are removed from the land. How there remains a connection between the people and the land. And through that, to have conversations with the people who are in the Bible study. And there were some wonderful stories that we heard about people who were forcibly removed from places in Cape Town and moved to where they are living now. We heard stories from people who were moved because of conflicts in other places in Africa and found their way now in Cape Town. And then there were others who had lived in the same house their whole lives, and for the first time I had to think about, what does it mean to have lived in the same place, to have called the same place home for my entire life? How do I relate to people who don't have that sense of security, and have not been able to have roots in the same way, who are living somewhere but don't consider that home? So it was a wonderful way of getting people to talk about these issues, so that this conversation of land isn't only a political one or an economic one, but it becomes a personal one and a theological one, as we speak about it in Bible studies and use those biblical stories to help us reflect on our own experiences of land. Then another one that I quite enjoy doing from the first season of Creation book is to use some of the elements of nature in our prayers. So as we pray, to use water and to pray for the waters, to have someone bring the water up to the altar, and that becomes part of our prayers, to have someone bring some of the soil as we pray for the land, and we place that on the altar and pray for it, to have some fruit or vegetables being brought, and we pray for food and for food security, and having those as symbols on the altar as we go along, as a visual representation of what we are praying for, but also to give the people a focus on what we are praying for. And then the last one, I've said playing games with the youth, but really, depending on the kind of games, we can really do it with anyone. Everyone likes games. Everyone likes jokes. Everyone likes things that are fun. And then out of that, we can then draw stories. We can then draw principles of what we've just experienced, and how that helps us to see a bigger picture. So just a few examples of some of the things that we've done, and how liturgy becomes a way in which we can talk about some of these bigger things, um, and not substitute the political story for the theology, but use the theology as a way of raising awareness in a way that still helps us to reflect on who God is, and helps us to understand who we are in God and who we are as a community. Whenever we talk about liturgy, we must talk about rubrics. What are rubrics? Rubrics come from the Latin word rubus, which means red. Before we had printing, before we had the ability to do mass printing, when liturgy was written out, the principle was we say the black and we do the red. So all the words that had to be spoken were written in black, and all the actions were written in red. Today, with our printing, the words that we speak are typed in normal font generally, and the rubrics are either in italics or in smaller print. But the rubrics are the rules or the laws of the liturgy. They help us to find the structure to the liturgy, and they help us to understand what what are we allowed to do, what must we do, what is optional, where can we change. And so even though we have quite a settled and quite a set liturgy that we use for the Eucharist or for morning and evening prayer, if we understand the rubrics, if we understand the rules, we can be quite creative around what we do with the liturgy. The rubrics help us understand what are the things that are non-negotiable, what are the things that we must do, and where are the areas that we can be creative. The rubrics also help us understand what are the roles and responsibilities, what are the things that a priest must do, and what are things that the rest of the community, that the rest of the people gathered are able to do. So just a few slides on how do we develop creative liturgy. The first thing to ask is, what is the issue that we want to address? Do we want to talk about climate change? Do we want to talk about water? Do we want to talk about biodiversity? Is there a local issue that we want to address? Do we want to talk about waste? Do we want to talk about plastic? Maybe you live near the coast and you want to talk about oceans. What is the issue that needs to be addressed? The second thing is, what is your goal with the service? What do you want to achieve? What is it that you want the people to know by the end of the service? Or what is it that you want them to go and do as a result of the service? Very important when we talk about liturgy is to understand that this is not a one size fits all. So, who is your liturgy aimed at? Who are the people who are going to engage in the liturgy? What is helpful for them? What might not be helpful for them? What are the different roles that they will play in the liturgy? What language do they speak? What are the stories that they might relate to? How do we aim our liturgy at our audience? And then what kind of service should this be? Do we do this in the context of a Eucharist? Can we use the daily offices of morning and evening prayer? Can we make use of an outdoor service, perhaps a Bible study? Another one, especially now during the lockdown, how do we use agape meals to facilitate conversations around the table within our homes? And then, of course, as I've just discussed, what are the rubrics for that particular type of service? So if we have a Eucharist, the rubrics would be different from if we had the daily office, would be different from having a Bible study, would be different from an agape meal. But what are the rules for that particular kind of service? And where can we be creative within the confines of those rules? Then what are the elements that we are able to introduce, that we can introduce in order to make the service creative? So where can we bring in different prayers? Are there prayers that are already written that we can make use of? Are there prayers that need to be written? Are there prayers that need to be adapted? What are the songs that we can sing that would make it helpful for us to think about the topic? What are the songs that people already know that we can bring back and help them reflect on again? Or new songs that must be written, or new things that must be introduced? Are there poems that we know about? Maybe poems that people in the congregation have written that can be read? What are the kinds of reflections that can happen, either through sermons, through silences, through writing in the service, through conversations or discussions? So, what are the elements that can be introduced to help people make sense of what we have here. And again, that fits within the rules of that particular kind of service. Who should be involved in the service? Are there things that only a priest can do, uh, like we have in the Eucharist, or only a bishop can do? Are there things that licensed lay ministers can do? Are there things that youth leaders are allowed to do? And then what are the things that the congregation will be able to do as well? So, after all of that talking, an exercise for today. I'd like us in our groups to think about an issue that we want to highlight. So either as a group, you want to talk about water, you want to talk about climate change, you want to talk about waste, whatever the issue is. And then think about what type of service would be most suited to talking about that topic. Have a discussion about what the rubrics or the rules are for that kind of service. Where are we allowed to be creative? What do we have to do? Where do we have space to be creative? What is the audience? And I want you to think about a specific audience that you want to aim it at. So even though we are from different communities, think about a community and then have a bit of a conversation around where is that community? What language do they speak? What kind of stories would they relate to? What kind of hymns and so on would be specific? Think about that audience and how we would structure the liturgy for that audience. Then who will be involved in running the liturgy? And then when we've got all of those things, then what are the elements, the prayers, the songs, the poems, the reflections? What are the elements that we will include in the liturgy that will help us to achieve our goal of what we want people to know by the end of that liturgy, or what we want them to be able to do after they've experienced the liturgy? Thank you.